Welcome to the State Library of New South Wales today, albeit virtually. I'm sitting in the Sir William Dixson Research Library in the State Library building, and I'd like to start by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora, the traditional owners of the land on which the library is situated, their elders past, present and emerging, and importantly, their continuing connection to country. In this anniversary year of the arrival of James Cook and the Endeavour on the east coast of Australia and at Botany Bay, today we'll look at that voyage in the context of some of the most significant European artefacts from that expedition, the logbooks that recorded the voyage day by day. James Cook's voyage in Endeavour was the first great European expedition of exploration that included scientific discovery as a major objective. The late 18th century was a period of acute international rivalry, principally between France and Britain, in the advancement of science and Pacific exploration. In intensity, it was a little bit like the mid-20th century rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union in space travel. There were, of course, successful voyages undertaken by other nations, but this was an era in science that was characterized by a sustained surge in exploration, and it was dominated by the British and the French. So long-standing imperial rivalries were often diverted into voyages of exploration and the pursuit of science with the aim of expanding competing European interests and the quest for new knowledge of the world. The spirit of the age was overwhelmingly scientific. It was a time when science and empiricism enjoyed unprecedented prestige, and voyages of exploration exemplified that. Published accounts of voyages, such as Cook's, reached an ever-widening readership in Britain and in Europe following his return in 1771 after 3 years at sea. There were constant demands for reprints and translations based on the logbooks and journals that were kept by those on board. The imperatives for Cook's first Pacific voyage from 1768 to 1771 were threefold. The first was astronomy. Cook was instructed to establish an observatory at Tahiti to record the transit of Venus when that planet passed between the Sun and the Earth on the 3rd of June in 1769. The data obtained from this and other observations of the transit that were stationed around the world was important for determining the distance between the Sun and the Earth, information vital to nautical navigation. The second goal was the continuing pursuit of the Great South Land, the most enduring myth really, which had attracted voyages of exploration since the 16th century, was of a southern landmass, a terra australis incognita, which was thought to exist to counterbalance the weight of the land in the northern hemisphere, australis meaning southern. At the end of the Endeavour voyage, they'd neither proved nor disproved the existence of a southern continent, although Cook believed it didn't exist, but they had filled in many gaps in the world map. The final aim of the expedition was natural history, observation and discovery, inspired, financed and directed by 25-year-old Joseph Banks, seen here in England wearing and surrounded by his Pacific trophies brought back with him from the Endeavour expedition. In addition to its usual complement of crew and marines, the Endeavour also included Banks and his party of natural scientists, artists, servants and assistants, and of course his good friend and colleague, the Swedish botanist Daniel Solander. No voyage had ever set sail better equipped for the study of natural history. Sailing then via Rio de Janeiro and Cape Horn, more than 3 months were spent at Tahiti preparing for the transit observation. Following Tahiti, they reached and circumnavigated and charted the islands of New Zealand. Sailing then due west, Cook could now not avoid reaching the Australian east coast. And the Endeavour arrived at Kamei at Botany Bay on the 29th of April in 1770. where they were confronted by two Guigal men carrying spears who met Cook and his men on the beach. And they tried to enforce the local protocols for arrival in the Kamei area. Unsuccessfully, neither side could communicate with the other, and shots were fired twice at the Guigal men. And this little sketch is Sydney Parkinson's original sketch of the Guigal people, Guigal men, with their canoes and shelters and also showing their shields. For Banks, the week they spent at Botany Bay was especially fruitful. Botany Bay yielded so many previously unrecorded additions to his botanical collection that were new to European botanical knowledge, that the specimens had to be dried on a sail spread on the shore at Botany Bay because they didn't have enough paper to press and preserve all of the specimens in the usual way. It was like a life-size florilegium on the shore. It was Banks's botanical successes which then prompted Cook to change the name Botany Bay, to Botany Bay rather than his original choice of Stingray Harbour or Stingray Bay because of the abundance of stingrays that they found there. For the members of the Endeavour expedition, though, their experience of Australia was probably dominated by events which took place after leaving Botany Bay. Sailing north along the eastern coastline, the Endeavour struck the Great Barrier Reef off the Queensland coast on the 10th of June in 1770, in very calm seas, but with huge swells that pushed them onto the submerged reef. Banks's journal vividly records their desperate situation. He writes, "Now, in my opinion, I entirely gave up the ship, and packing what I thought I might save, prepared myself for the worst. If, as was probable, she should take more water when we hauled off the reef, she must sink, and we well knew that our boats were not capable of carrying us all ashore, so that some, probably the most of us, must be drowned." So it was desperate. Remarkably though, with the ship's hull successfully fothered, so covered from beneath the ship by a sail that had been impregnated, so pressed in with wool and with oakum being, they'd untwisted the fibres of ropes. The Endeavour then was lifted off the reef on a high tide and guided to the mouth of the Endeavour River, near the site of present-day Cooktown, where repairs were carried out. Here, given their longer stay, the British did have a little more contact with a small group of the local people who made several visits to the British camp, and artist Sydney Parkinson, one of Banks's party, compiled a vocabulary of language which included their nearest approximation of the word which we have come to know as kangaroo, Parkinson's leaping quadruped. And I know this drawing is a little bit difficult to see, but it's a very delicate drawing of a kangaroo by Parkinson, and now another one of the kangaroo jumping. So after a stay of 6 weeks, the Endeavour sailed out of Australian waters via the Torres Strait, and then on the 26th of August, Cook took possession of the country for King George III on Possession Island. Cook's last evocative word on Australia was for the Aboriginal inhabitants. Echoing Voltaire, he painted an idyllic word picture of the people, blaming prosperity and commerce for the ills of civilization. So Cook wrote, "From what I have said of the natives of New Holland," so by that he means his earlier remarks about the indigenous people, "they may appear to be the most wretched people upon earth, but in reality they are far happier than we Europeans, being wholly unacquainted not only with the superfluous, but the necessary conveniences so sought after in Europe. They are happy in not knowing the use of them. They live in a tranquillity which is not disturbed by the inequality of condition. The earth and sea of their own accord furnishes them with all things necessary for life." To Paya, a Pacific Islander who travelled with the Endeavour, made this drawing of the people at Botany Bay. The final leg of the Endeavour voyage included an extended stopover at Batavia, now Jakarta, then the centre of the Dutch East India Company, which the Dutch had built, created the city, modelled on their familiar system of canals for easy transportation of goods. In Indonesia's tropical climate, these stagnant canals just became breeding grounds for disease such as dysentery, typhoid, and malaria. And during and after their stay in Batavia, the Endeavour lost around 1/3 of its complement of 90 men, including Tupaia. On the 26th of October, Joseph Banks commented that the seamen now fall sick so fast that the tents ashore were always full of the sick. After the Endeavour returned to England in the middle of 1771, the Admiralty appointed John Hawkesworth to write the official account of Cook's first Pacific voyage. Public interest in the account was really high, and the book immediately became a bestseller when it was published in July 1773, so well after Cook had already left on his second Pacific voyage. So with Cook not even there, Hawkesworth used the logbook that Cook had written on the Endeavour to write his official account. And as with many editors, Hawkesworth also changed passages to improve them where he thought it was necessary. But along with the logbook written in Cook's hand on the Endeavour, there exist several other versions or copies. Of these, 2 are particularly significant because they were written on the Endeavour, not back in England subsequent to the voyage, and they were written out, they were copied by Cook's shipboard clerk, a man called Richard Orton. And we refer to copies like this as fair copies, so neat and exact copies made from an original document. And this image shows a page from Cook's logbook, rewritten and corrected, and we'll look at that shortly. So what is a logbook? What's intended or required to be recorded, and why? Logbooks were not optional. Keeping an accurate daily log was a requirement of the Admiralty. Logbooks are one of the most, if not the most important artefacts of any voyage. They're first-hand, day-by-day accounts of the activities on board ship. They mostly record fairly routine but important information, so date, location, latitude and longitude, speed, wind direction, accounts of the weather, meteorological observations, scientific information gathered during the voyage. But they can also record thoughts, impressions, and observations. The term logbook originates from the way sailors measured speed by tying regularly spaced knots along a length of rope, or knotting pieces of rag to a rope. And the rope was then weighted at the end with a log. The rope and the log were thrown overboard, and the length of the rope that extended was measured by the number of knots that extended over the side during a specified time, usually timed by hourglass or by counting, or it could even be by reciting a specified timed set of words, so not an exacting technique. This then provided a record of the speed of the ship in knots, and this information was recorded in the book of the logbook. Cook's log on the Endeavour was at least in triplicate, so there was the 1 copy written daily by Cook in his hand, and then 2 copies written out by his clerk, by Richard Orton. But why were copies created? Several versions of a diary, letter, report, or a logbook were often written for circulation to others, or to ensure safe delivery of a document in the days of long, uncertain sea voyages. As well as requiring ship's captains to keep logbooks of shipboard proceedings and ports of call, the Admiralty also required that a copy be forwarded to them every 6 months or so when Royal Navy ships arrived at various ports. Now, that's not so easily done on voyages such as Cook's, to the far side of the world in areas where established ports and routes to Britain didn't exist. Cook nonetheless understood the requirement to keep copies, and he had his clerk write them out, even if he also understood the opportunity to send them back was unlikely to arise too often. So copying documents was standard. 18 years later, in Sydney Cove, with the arrival of the First Fleet, Governor Arthur Phillip routinely wrote 2, sometimes 3 versions of official documents to England from New South Wales, sent in different ships, sometimes copied in his own hand or sometimes in the hand of a clerk. And his first dispatch of letters from Sydney Cove was in triplicate, sent via 3 different ships when the ships of the First Fleet returned to England, left the colony then in July 1788. All of those letters were acknowledged as safely received in June 1789. And so much is known about the French expedition of La Perouse that disappeared after leaving Botany Bay in 1788, because before leaving, La Perouse entrusted Arthur Phillip with copies of the expedition's final letters and dispatches, charts and journals for safekeeping, for Arthur Phillip then to forward them home to Paris. So despite La Perouse's expedition being shipwrecked and never returning to Europe, all of his accounts up until the point of Botany Bay were safely preserved and returned to Europe. So copies were important. So what are the various versions of Cook's log? Do they differ? Where are they now? And how did they get there? The version considered to be the original, or the nearest to original that we know of, is held in the National Library of Australia. It's the only version that we know of to be written in Cook's own hand on a daily basis while on the Endeavour, and it has many of the characteristics of an original document. So words and sentences have frequently been crossed out, rubbed out, rewritten. There's additional text added between the lines of the original text. There are additions in the margins and even smaller sheets, and we can see that right at the bottom 1/3 of this page, smaller sheets with textual additions which Cook has adhered to the page and then keyed back into the logbook narrative, so adding things that he'd overlooked or forgotten to include the first time. Fair copies, on the other hand, are more often written in a uniform, precise hand with errors of transcription rather than extensive crossing out or rewriting of text. In 1923, Cook's original logbook was bought at auction for the National Library for £5,000 under slightly confused circumstances. It was originally intended for the Mitchell Library collection, and the New South Wales principal librarian had even offered the logbook's owner £5,000 to buy the volume ahead of the auction, and the offer was declined. The Commonwealth Parliamentary Library, at the time the forerunner to the National Library of Australia, hadn't had any intention of bidding for the Endeavour log until the newly elected Prime Minister Stanley Bruce had been encouraged to consider acquiring it for the Commonwealth, a trophy acquisition in a way, to mark the beginning of his prime ministership. The principal librarian of New South Wales, meanwhile, W.H. Ifold, had already been sent to London to bid on behalf of the Mitchell Library and was now directed to bid instead on behalf of the Commonwealth. The bid was successful at £5,000, and the journal came to Sydney, where it was held for safekeeping at the New South Wales Library for 4 years until the National Library was formed in Canberra with the relocation of Parliament from Melbourne to Canberra. And so the Endeavour log written by Cook became the National Library's MS1, Manuscript number 1. Prior to its appearance at auction in 1923, the whereabouts of this log, of Cook's copy of the log, had been unknown until the 1950s. When Cook's widow Elizabeth died in 1835, she'd been widowed then for more than 50 years following Cook's death in Hawaii in 1779 during his third Pacific voyage. And all 6 of their children had also predeceased Elizabeth. There were no grandchildren. During her lifetime, some of her husband's remaining papers, including this logbook, had been dispersed by her to her cousin, Isaac Smith, by now a rear admiral in the Royal Navy, but in 1770 he was an able seaman on the Endeavour, soon to be promoted midshipman. In 1865, Smith family descendants sold the log at auction to a man called Henry Bolko, a Prussian-born Cook enthusiast and a wealthy businessman and parliamentarian who'd made his fortune in iron in Yorkshire. The sale was unpublicised. Bolko kept the manuscript and it sort of faded from view. Until then, in 1923, it was Bolko's great-nephew and heir who offered it for sale at auction when it was acquired for the National Collection of Australia. Cook usually wrote his dates in red ink, and it's a little bit difficult to see that the red has faded somewhat. And he used the left page often for strict log entries, as fairly standard, so those strict entries of date, wind, weather, etc. And then the right side of the page opening included more narrative journal entries. And as time passed, his account of places and events became more descriptive, and his thoughts and reflections start to creep in. So the detached recording of events and facts required by the Royal Navy couldn't necessarily always preclude highly emotional responses. And we see that practical and scientific documents such as journals and logbooks also include feelings and sentiment, and certainly preconceptions, misconceptions and understandings, as much as the stated aim of these documents to record objective observation. Cook also wrote on large sheets of paper folded in 2, which gave him sections of 4 folio pages, which at some point then were bound together into a volume. In 1975 then, the log was sent back to England to be rebound in a UK bindery in an impressive but stylistically odd and inappropriate medieval style binding with leather spine and oak or beech wood timber boards, which is how it remains today. For Cook on the Endeavour, the first opportunity to actually send a copy of his logbook to the Admiralty, as was expected of ship's captains, came after 2.5 years at Batavia, when they were already on the final homeward leg of their voyage. The Endeavour stayed at Batavia from October to December 1770, completing repairs to the ship from that wrecking on the Great Barrier Reef. The logbook dispatched from Batavia wasn't written in Cook's hand. It was rather one written in the hand of his clerk, Richard Orton, so one of those 2 copies that Orton kept on board the Endeavour. The entries in this version stop on the 23rd of October 1770 at Batavia, and it's clearly the copy that Cook sent home to the Admiralty from that port on a returning Dutch ship. And this copy, the Batavia copy, is held here in the collection of the Mitchell Library at the State Library of New South Wales. After it was sent to the Admiralty, the journal then seems to have stayed with Sir Philip Stevens, Secretary to the Admiralty, who was also a personal friend and a great supporter of Cook. And he seems to have just held on to this copy. It then passed through Stevens' family by descent, and you can see the various records of ownership and different notations about it pasted into the front end paper of the volume. And it came into the possession of Lord Renler, whose son then sold it in 1885 to Frederick William Cozzens, a book collector. In the 1890s then, Cosm sold it to another collector, John Corner, who had hoped to publish it before he died suddenly, shortly after acquiring the logbook. Then in 1895, Australian-born shipping merchant Frederick Dangar bought it from Corner's executors and presented it to the Australian Museum in Sydney. In 1935 then, it was transferred along with other Cook manuscripts to the Mitchell Library. And it remains in the Mitchell Library collection today, where it's referred to somewhat confusingly, even for us, as the Corner Journal for John Corner, who owned it only very briefly. Only 6 months after the first copy was sent to England, when the ship finally arrived home in July 1771, the second copy of the Log of the Voyage, also written in Orton's hand, was sealed and sent to the Admiralty. This copy finishes at a later date than either of the other two versions, including the version written in Cook's hand, and we don't really have an explanation for that at this stage. The final entries of the Admiralty copy, of this copy that you see, continue to the end of the voyage, and it's in fact the only version that is complete for the entire voyage, including, confusingly, as I've mentioned, the original version in Cook's hand. Each of the copies written out by Richard Orton consist of 4 thick segments that divide the volume clearly into 4 parts, and Orton has created a title page for each part, which does not appear in Cook's version, the version in Cook's hand. Again, they've been written on large folded sheets to form 4 folios, but this time grouped together like 4 thick notebooks. And you can see that quite clearly here. The sheets then have been written on as loose unbound sheets and then subsequently bound together later into a single volume in England, meaning that because of the thickness of each segment, when you put all of the pages together, that part of the words written in the centre or the gutter of the folds has been obscured by the binding, which in the corner, the Mitchell Library copy, the binding has also broken over time. And there are a number of other copies created by various people in England after the return of the voyage, and also fragments of copies where people have copied out part of the logbook. A version now in the British Library seems also to have originated from the Endeavour voyage. It was once in the possession of Sir Joseph Banks and should probably rightly have passed to the Admiralty at the end of the voyage, but it appears to have been used by several members of the crew during the voyage who were keeping their own logs and journals and who copied from shared versions. So there's still a lot of work and study to be done to compile and understand all of the versions and their histories in relation to each other. Another copy was part of the Royal Library at Windsor Castle, and you can see the Windsor Library bookplate here. It was presented to George III, who'd taken a great interest in the voyage, and in 1935 it was then presented to the National Maritime Museum at Greenwich by King George V. This one's not quite a straightforward copy of the journal, and it's been written in 3 or 4 different hands, which you can see on these pages. Now, Cook himself didn't write his journal straight off and leave it unrevised. He did a great deal of drafting and redrafting, as we've seen, and we can see this process in the log that's been written in his hand. So the subsequent versions then written by Orton, by his clerk, are neater and less altered. Travelling north along the east coast of Australia, the wording often varies between copies, though the events are exactly the same. A detailed analysis of textual differences and changes isn't possible here, though it could be fun, and it's one of the reasons that copies are of interest. They're rarely simply copies. In the case of manuscript documents, copies can often demonstrate a change of heart, a softening or a hardening of a particular view, with even a brief passage of time. Once the adrenaline of an immediate situation or danger has passed and there's been a little time to reflect. And we can look at some of the important textual revisions. Cook used the name New South Wales at this stage, referring to the entire length of the Australian east coast. Initially, though, as we can see on this page of the corner journal, the first copy, he used New Wales, and that's the form that we see in the logbook in Cook's hand in the National Library and in the corner journal, the version held in the Mitchell Library. The Admiralty copy, now in the National Archives at Kew, uses the revised term New South Wales. So there's been a progression of thought from one copy to the next. And this one shows, as we've said, a page of the corner log, the Mitchell Library copy. It's of course known that Botany Bay was at first called Stingray Harbour, then Stingray Bay by Cook because of the number of stingrays seen and caught there. But because Banks had accumulated such a large collection of plants, all new to European science, Cook then reconsidered and changed the name to Botany Bay, and we can see that process here, where he's written Stingray Harbour, then Bay, and then crossed it out and replaced Stingray with Botany Bay. This then is the rewritten version in his clerk's hand in the corner journal Mitchell copy. So we can see that the text is still being reworked, but less so. We can see that the word stingray has been crossed out, rubbed out, and botany for Botany Bay written over it. And there's a closer version of it. Stingrays drawn at Botany Bay by Herman Spurring are particularly lovely drawings. Spurring was one of the artists employed by Joseph Banks, and again these gentle, lovely pencil sketches are a little bit difficult to see, but very lovely. Each of the versions of the logbooks then shows some revision through the use of different versions of names, different finishing dates, slightly different versions of events. But Cook has also looked over and made corrections in his own hand that appear throughout Orton's neatly written copies. And of course the final entry was signed by Cook as true and correct, which we can see on this last page of the corner log. All versions show individual quirks of spelling and punctuation, but that's just typical of the 18th century. English spelling wasn't standardized until late 18th, early 19th century, and spelling was often phonetic. Some words could even be spelled different ways within the same document. Punctuation mightn't follow modern conventions if it was used at all. And each has been written using iron gall ink, an ink that was commonly used up until the 20th century and made to various recipes that included crushed galls from oak trees, so the galls that form when insects bore into the oak trees. They're picked and used to create the ink, iron sulfate solution and gum arabic for binding. Now, iron gall ink was preferred precisely for the qualities that make it destructive to paper over time. Its indelibility is what makes it so desirable, that the ink soaked into the paper rather than sat on the surface of it, meaning it was difficult to erase or alter without leaving traces, as we've seen. And it was originally used on parchment, where they actually wanted to be able to scrape the parchment back and reuse it. But of course on paper they couldn't do that, and it wasn't really desired. And because each batch was made differently using whatever was to hand, each batch of iron gall ink, so including what they used to create the solution. So preferably it was water that they used, but they could use wine, they could use vinegar, even urine, any number of things that could be used. And this all makes for an ink that, to varying degrees, depending on the original recipe, is destructive to paper. The iron in the ink effectively rusts and corrodes the paper until eventually the ink cracks the paper and the words fall away, leaving only holes. And you can see that quite clearly on this heavily used page, which is recording part of the time that Endeavour spent at Botany Bay. Because of that destruction, that inbuilt destruction, the corner journal at the Mitchell Library, the corner log, is currently undergoing extensive treatment by the library's expert conservators in our labs underneath where I sit in this building on the floor below. The treatment includes washing each page in a special bath that reduces the acidity of the ink and the acidity in the paper. And I know this sounds counterintuitive, but it's a particular and specialized procedure that only takes place after extensive solubility testing of the ink. That is then followed by individual repairs to each and every hole or tear. The treatment here at the library has been planned, discussed and considered over several years, and it's taken many, many months to complete to stabilise the logbook into the future. And that project, that work, is being led by one of the library's conservators, Kate Hughes. First-hand accounts, first-hand and eyewitness accounts, such as these logbooks, remain one of our most important links to our past, in this case, to past voyages of exploration. But just as every story has many perspectives, there are many views on the legacy of 1770 and Cook and the Endeavour. And in this anniversary year, many opportunities for all views to be heard. Details of Pacific Islands, of the Americas, of Terra Australis and other distant worlds stimulated serious reflection in 18th century Europe, giving some Europeans at least a comparative perspective on their own religions, folklore and culture, and handing philosophers of the Enlightenment one of their most effective tactics for questioning traditional European beliefs and assumptions. It came as a great shock to Europe to be told, for instance, that the Aboriginal peoples of Australia might, as James Cook asserted in his logbook, be far happier than we Europeans.